Let me introduce the first speaker, Achim Reese, who studied architecture at Technische Hochschule in Aachen and at Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. He was working as an editorial staff of the Berlin architectural journal Arch Plus. He prepared his PhD thesis and defended it in 2021. And Achim Reese is now working as an editor in Berlin and is teaching history and theory of architecture at the Technical University in Munich at the same time. Achim, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you very much for both the kind introduction and the invitation. Having followed the presentations by all your experts in the past 2 years, past 2 days, I feel really flattered and maybe a bit bold to now bombard you with my work in progress. About the progress, I'm not yet sure, but we'll see. In the first half, all you Mendelssohniacs will be confronted with lots of stuff you may know already. In the second part, there's some things which I myself am completely unsure, so maybe you can help me out, and I'm very much looking forward. As I've dealt with the architecture of American postmodernism in the past 5 years, it was this image which sparked my interest. Taken by the director Fritz Lang, whom Mendelssohn had met on a transatlantic crossing in 1924. It's one of the 77 images in the book Bilderbuch eines Architekten by Mendelsohn. Following his 1924 trip to the United States, which took him to New York and the Midwest, Mendelssohn used electric light as a means of design too. We already saw images of the Herpich redesign on Leipziger Straße, and Mendelssohn confidently explains that, quote, for the first time electrically lit advertising has become part of the architecture. A similar interplay of electric lighting and architecture can also be observed in Mendelssohn design interiors, such as that of the Universum Cinema on Kurfürstendamm, the electric light retracing or literally highlighting the dynamic architectural shapes. Furthermore, it gets obvious that Mendelssohn paid interest not only to the utilization, but also to the generation of electricity. In the 1929 book Russland, Europa, Amerika, ein architektonischer Querschnitt, so an architectural cross-section, the architect presents this perspective of a Kiev power plant. In the same publication, the readers find a photograph of a still unfinished power station in Detroit that Mendelssohn had visited in the course of his earlier trip. The letter he wrote to Louisa Mendelssohn right after the visit in 1924 testifies to the strong impression the construction site had left on him. Quote, together with the engineers, we drove to the largest power station in America, which has just been 50% completed. 10 stories high, a vertical mechanical plant with 300,000 volts of electric power. The boilers, turbine, coal feeders, etc. of dimensions that contradict themselves. In the 1923 lecture, Dynamik und Funktion, Mendelssohn then described architecture as, quote, a union of the sensually apprehensible mass and the transcendent mass of light. This, of course, brings to mind Le Corbusier's famous dictum, according to which architecture can be understood as the play of masses brought together in light. On closer inspection, it becomes clear that in Version Architecture, Le Corbusier did not only think of sunlight, but of artificial lighting too. However, when this makes him call on his readers to demand that their landlords install electric lamps, it gets obvious that he thinks of a usage of electricity and of electric light that is considerably more modest, more mundane, more down to earth than the efforts by Mendelssohn, which we've seen before. But how come that electrical energy is so important to Mendelssohn? That he was not primarily interested in technical aspects is already suggested by the description of the Detroit power plant. In fact, the architect confuses electric potential, 300,000 volts, with electric power, usually expressed in units of watt. Hence, in the course of this presentation, I'd like to introduce 3 other, partly preliminary answers to the previously posed question about the role of electricity in Mendelssohn's work. The fact that two outstanding representatives of the avant-garde, so Le Corbusier and Erich Mendelsohn, took a stand on this issue at the beginning of the 1920s is at least a reminder that electricity and this electric light was not yet taken for granted everywhere and for everyone. The first central power plant, which supplied various customers with electricity for different uses, had been built only 40 years earlier on Pearl Street in New York. And this just a couple of steps away from Broadway, which we saw in the first pictures. After a similar plant went on stream in Milan in 1883, the first central power station in Berlin, built on the initiative of Emil Rathenau, went into operation 2 years later. When Mendelssohn began training as a merchant in Berlin in 1907, the city was already the focal point of the European electricity industry. After World War I, when Mendelssohn's architectural career took off in the same place, Berlin had earned a reputation as an electropolis. As conservationist Thorsten Dahme has stated, this honorary title took into account the close connection between research and development, production, testing and application in everyday urban life. Consequently, the new industry came along with new architecture. Among the numerous buildings that Peter Behrens designed for the company AEG, the Turbine Hall in Berlin's Moabit district has attracted particular attention. Mendelsohn, however, as we know, was less than impressed by the factory, judging that Behrens's design lacked consistency. In particular, the stylized temper front contradicted his demand that, quote, architecture must be an expression of the will and the spirit of its time. In contrast to such an adoption of traditional architectural forms, the settlement des Auteurs, Bauhaus project, is found to be determined by an appropriation of the electricity infrastructure. As the pictures of photographer Emil Theis show, the buildings were grouped around a power pole which had to serve as a strong symbol of progress. In comparison, Mendelssohn's approach is characterized by an effort to give expression to contemporary phenomena by new, however, genuinely architectural means. And last night, Louisa Hutton quoted from Mendelssohn's description that the adopted Mosse house was, on the one hand, to reflect reality, while on the other hand, intended to tame down its chaos. So, coming back to my starting point, American postmodernism, very much unlike Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, who half a century later were to explain in their study, Learning from Las Vegas, that the commercial structures along the highway required a new mode of perception. Mendelssohn relied very much on architecture as an organizing power. In his Bilderbuch, he had written that the nocturnal neon signs on Broadway were, quote, still disordered because exaggerated, but already full of fantastic beauty, which one way will be perfected. And no doubt that Mendelssohn is the one to fulfill this perfection. And following the example of Soviet constructivism, here another example from Russland, Europa, America, Mendelssohn sought to achieve this perfection by integrating electric lighting as well as illuminated advertising into architecture. The promise that accompanied electricity at the beginning of the 20th century was repeatedly claimed as a political argument. And probably it has never been expressed as clear as in Lenin's famous statement, according to which communism equals Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. Mendelssohn became, and we heard about that before, with the political dimension of electrification in 1923, when the entrepreneur Pinchas Rutenberg contacted him. After obtaining a concession from the British government and establishing the Palestine Electric Corporation, Rutenberg commissioned Mendelssohn to design infrastructure buildings for the power supply, including a power plant to be built here in Haifa. Although the design was not realized, Ita Heinze Greenberg attests to its quality of a catchy tune or an architectural earworm. All later designs, including the one executed, would have referred to the drawings that Mendelssohn had made together with Hendrikus Weidefeld in the spring of 1923. And I think I learned yesterday that Richard Neutra played a part in that too. In contrast, the concept developed by the architect and publicist Hermann Sörgel in 1923, initially named Pan-Europa, remained completely unrealized. It's presumably due to his efforts to distance himself from Richard Coudenhove-Kollege's initiative Pan-Europa that from the 1930s on he made the project known under the title Atlantropa. And this is something too I learned just recently, that Rainer Schitzeichel would be the perfect man to talk about that. I'm going to continue anyway. So Zergel's considerations were based on the reflections about the role that Europe could assert vis-à-vis the new superpowers, namely the United States and the Soviet Union after World War I. And I mean, we find this with many European intellectuals. If you think about José Ortega y Gasset, La Rebelión de las Masas, and I think it gets even obvious from Russland, Europa, America too. So the quest for the role that the European nations might take on after 1918. Zergel's approach to the subject was very much shaped by the philosopher Oswald Spengler in his work Der Untergang des Abendlandes, so the decline of the West. Accordingly, as you can read here, the architect Hermann Zergel understood his project as a, quote, political power that should save the culture of the Occident from decline. Based on the premise that European nationalism could be overcome, Zergel envisioned the construction of huge dams at Gibraltar and the Dardanelles. Later plans included another facility between Sicily and the Tunisian coast. This would not only have created the opportunity for hydroelectric power generation on an unprecedented scale, the dams would also have made it possible to gain new settlement areas of around almost 600,000 square kilometers and to establish rail transport between Europe and Africa. An essential part of the project was the colonial exploitation of African resources as well as the utilization of its agricultural land. Referring to antiquity, Zergel emphasized that Africa, quote, this huge neighboring country, so conveniently located for Europe, always stimulates to gain new living space. Adapted from biology by the geographer Friedrich Ratzel and taken up by his colleague Karl Haushofer, this conception of living space, Lebensraum in German, became central to the National Socialist ideology. Zergel's relationship, however, is said to have remained ambivalent in this case. For a long time, he remained in close contact with progressive architects who not only produced designs for dams and bridges, but also conceived port facilities and residential buildings that were to be erected on the new coasts. Among them were Peter Behrens, Hans Pölzig, Cornelis van Isteren, and Louis Welzenbacher. Among the colleagues who at least declared their willingness to collaborate were Mies van der Rohe and, as we know, Erich Mendelsohn. So this is the acknowledgement of, at the beginning of Zergel's 1923 book, Atlantropa, and you see in the 7th line, Erich Mendelsohn is in charge of the planning for the new land, which was meant then to emerge at the front of the then British Mandate of Palestine. In the same year, so 1923, Mendelsohn described his motivation to participate in the project in his lecture Der schöpferische Sinn der Krise, the creative meaning of crisis. In his opinion, Zergel's project must be seen as a peacemaking. Mendelsohn explains that, quote, great supranational tasks are necessary which create new space, new living space, new working space. I am thinking, among others, of the Pan-Europa project, which aims to restore Europe's real fertile land, the Mediterranean basin, by lowering the once flooded areas with the help of the Gibraltar Dam. Moreover, Mendelsohn believes that the project can contribute to the world's pacification by providing electricity as a resource. And of course, all these issues of resources, especially fertile resources, were part of the ongoing political crisis in the run-up to World War II. In the lecture, The Fate of This Hour, which Mendelsohn gave in Brussels a few months later, shortly after the Nazis came to power and he had to leave Germany, the architect emphasized that the alarming state of the world not only required globally coordinated investments and control of money flows. In addition to calling for a just distribution of living space, he also stressed the importance of quote, great power generating centers for the needs of a humanity that has found its way back to the earth, its magnet. While Mendelsohn counts a detachment of the people from the soil among the consequences of the crisis, he sees its cause in an imbalance between mechanical and spiritual forces. Quote, the more frantic the one-sided pull of mechanical force, the more complete the defeat of the human comedy. If the architect had already in 1919 referred to the fundamental changes in human relations, in economy and science, religion and art, he was subsequently to specify that not least the finding of physics had shaken the existing worldview. In the same lecture he concludes, Physical science gains insight into the non-steady structural relations of energy through the quantum theory of the German Max Planck, and reorders the physical processes and the space-time structure of the world through Einstein's theory of relativity. Yeah, we all know, and I think Michael Benedict mentioned yesterday, that this also found its reverberations in the writings of Siegfried Gideon, however, on a different level, as I'd like to show. This very idea that the insights of science, and namely of physics, had challenged the earlier worldview, while at the same time revealed a new order, is set forth in Mendelssohn's lecture Dynamik und Funktion. In view of the rationally no longer comprehensible findings of the research, Planck, Einstein, and other physicists felt compelled to comment on religious questions in both writings and lectures. Similarly, Mendelssohn connects the scientific insights with aspects of spirituality. From the mysterious union of order and chaos, of the created and the organic, and of the rational and the transcendent, a new religious sense will arise. Since the realization that the terms energy and matter, which had once been separated by science, are just different conditions of the same fundamental material, and that nothing in the order of the world happens except in relation to the cosmos, the engineer has forsaken mechanics, the theory of dead matter, and has returned to the dutiful service of nature. Since these remarks remain rather vague, or at least for me very hard to grasp, it seems advisable to contrast them with Mendelssohn's architecture. And Kathleen James' reflections in Mendelssohn and the architecture of German modernism prove very helpful here, because in her book she draws on a letter sent by the architect to Louise Mendelssohn in 1919, recapitulating a conversation with Erwin Finlay-Freundlich and Professor Rosenstein. The letter writer describes that, quote, the dispute between the three of us about unsuspected connections and congruences of energy and matter, which according to Einstein are not separate notions, but the same source of life. James, quoting more extensively from the letter, thus substantiates the proposition that the Einstein Tower should be understood not only as an observatory, but also as a monument. As a counterpart to the imperial era monuments that paid homage to the nation, this Republican monument is dedicated to relativity. But, I mean, if in the notion of the architect, these scientific findings on energy and mass represented such a crucial and fundamental change in the view of the world, doesn't it seem kind of likely that beyond the observatory they also influenced Mendelssohn's subsequent designs? As you all know, almost simultaneously with the completion of the Einstein Tower, the construction of the Luckenwalde hat factory began. It is noticeable, I think, that the architect does not arrange the factory's power plant in a solely functional way, for example, by placing it in any subordinate building. Instead, prominently positioned in the main axis of the complex, the power plant also towers above the expressive dye works building. Again, you might say it was huge, he couldn't hide it, so he just tried to make the best. But as is well known, it was due to the innovative ventilation system of the Luckenwalde dye works that the Soviet Union commissioned Mendelssohn as the first foreign architect with a project in Leningrad. In his design for the textile factory, power generation is once again located in a prominent position. So it's down there. The power plant, which unlike the other parts of the building was executed according to Mendelssohn's design, rises like the bow of a ship at the western corner of the factory site. In both cases, so, the transformation of chemical energy into thermal, kinetic, and finally electrical energy is celebrated by architectural means. If one considers that, on the one hand, mass and energy are the subject of spiritual consideration at this time, and that, on the other hand, Mendelssohn in 1923 mentions that the technical ideas of the time will have to be expanded into, quote, realizations into in a sacred realm, one could assume that this electric architecture is characterized by a spiritual trait. This, of course, raises the question about the kind of spirituality this might be. And here I am at a point where I can't give you any precise answer, so I'm just going to try to mark out that field. I think that probably it would be too hasty to just conclude that Mendelssohn followed Einstein, who, referring to Spinoza, at that time professed a pantheistic concept of God. Dealing with the extraordinary relationship between spirituality and electric energy, it seems indispensable to also take into account the considerations which the mathematician and philosopher Lazarus Ben-David had made towards the end of the 18th century. A member of the Berlin Haskalah, Ben-David became known through the popularization of Immanuel Kant's Kritiken, as well as through his own writings. In a letter to the philosopher Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, Ben-David had expressed himself on die innere Einrichtung der Stiftshütte, that is, the interior of the tabernacle. The text, published in 1797 in the Berlin journal Archiv der Zeit und ihres Geschmacks, reveals an attempt to reconcile religious traditions with Enlightenment thinking. Convinced that electricity had been available since the time of Moses, Ben-David attempts to explain religious miracles in scientific terms. Thus he describes the Ark of the Covenant as a Leyden jar, an early capacitor capable of emitting electric shocks. Accordingly, the spirits of the Holy Temple would not have served as lightning rods, but on the contrary, to conduct electricity into the sanctuary. The enthusiastic reception of Ben-David's considerations is evidenced by a commentary by the art historian Alois Hirt, who explicitly praised the philosopher's assessment and tried to support them with additional arguments. My only problem is, as hard as I tried, so far I couldn't find the missing link, but if I understood correctly, Caroline Jessen promised to find it in the Schocken archive for me. So I can't really show that there's a link to these deistically based consideration, but it seems very likely that the architect was familiar with the so-called energetic developed by the chemist Wilhelm Ostwald. Ostwald, who was in contact with Einstein, had also supervised the dissertation of Finlay Freundlich's brother Erwin. Moreover, the scientist frequented the art and architecture scene of the late Empire and the Weimar Republic. A member of the Deutsche Werkbund since 1912, he presented his color theory at the Dessau Bauhaus in 1927 at the invitation of Walter Gropius. With Oswald, Mendelsohn shared not only the interest in large-scale supranational projects. Furthermore, the term energy, which Mendelsohn uses in his letter frequently, plays a central role in Oswald's thinking too. And it's always the idea of linking energy, the scientific notion of energy, with what we consider as kind of élan vital, or passion. That is, in view of the scientific and economic upheavals of his time, Oswald, the 1909 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, so he was just not just any lunatic, was concerned to establish a new connection between all the world's phenomena. The author Volker Müller thus explains that in place of a dualistic separation of substance and force, being and consciousness, matter and spirit, Oswald's energetic provided a monistic philosophy of nature. Accordingly, energy is understood as the one general and essential substance. The ethical character of this worldview is attested to by the energetic imperative, which Oswald formulated in reference to Immanuel Kant. Do not waste energy, utilize and refine it. It's even nicer in German since it rhymes. As I said, this is now mainly bits and pieces, and I hope to, in the future, come closer to this concept of spiritual energy or energetic spirituality in Mendelssohn's work. And so I'm very much looking forward to your comments. Maybe someone knows to help me out. If at the same time there are doubts whether clarification is really possible, it's due to the statement Mendelssohn gives in Dynamik und Funktion. Ultimately, large outdated hierarchies dissolve through lack of credibility. A vertical orientation of beliefs and its conflict between the orthodox and the heretic will be replaced by the coexistence of religious elements, mysticism, secret doctrines, and miracles. After the forced departure from Germany, the building tasks Mendelssohn dealt with changed. We heard about that several times. The only factory building from the period after 1933 is a chemical plant conceived together with Serge Shemaev in the British town of Huddersfield. There is reason to assume that Mendelssohn was particularly concerned with the planning of the power station. The architect's last project, completed only posthumously, is a laboratory building at the University of California at Berkeley. Designed for the Atomic Energy Commission, it served to research an energy source that in the 1950s was not only considered novel, but also inexhaustible. Thank you very much.